My brother laughed and said it loud enough for the entire table to hear. Daniel's been unemployed for 6 months, so don't let him pick up the check tonight. A few people chuckled politely. Others looked down at their menus. I just lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the moment pass without saying a word. The restaurant was one of those places that tried very hard to remind you how expensive it was. Dark wood walls, soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers, and a view of the harbor that stretched out like a painting through the tall windows. The kind of place where the steaks started around $70 and the wine list had more pages than the menu. My brother Michael loved places like this. He loved the attention, the sense that everyone around him could see he belonged there. Tonight was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Our mother had turned 65 the week before, and Michael insisted we celebrate somewhere special. That was his word. Special. Which usually meant somewhere he could tell stories about himself while everyone else listened. The table was full, our mother Linda sitting at the head, Michael beside her, his wife Caroline across from him, 2 of our cousins, and me at the far end near the window. The waiter had just poured the second round of drinks when Michael leaned back in his chair, smiling the way he did when he thought he was about to deliver something clever. You know, he said, pointing his fork toward me like it was part of the punchline, Daniel's been taking a little career break lately. Someone asked what he meant. Michael shrugged with exaggerated sympathy. Unemployed, he said. 6 months now. The word hung over the table like a cloud nobody wanted to walk through. My cousin Tyler shifted in his chair. Caroline gave Michael a look that suggested maybe this wasn't the best topic for dinner, but Michael only leaned further into it. He had always enjoyed an audience. It's fine though, he continued, raising his glass. Everyone goes through rough patches, right? A few awkward laughs followed. I noticed the couple at the next table glance over for a second before returning to their own conversation. My mother cleared her throat and tried to change the subject, asking the waiter about the seafood special, but Michael wasn't finished yet. I told Daniel he should apply here, he added, gesturing around the dining room. They probably need someone to wash dishes in the back. Another short laugh escaped him, louder than the others, like he wanted the whole room to hear the joke land. I studied the condensation sliding slowly down the side of my glass. Michael had always been like this. Even when we were kids, he had a way of turning small things into performances. If he scored higher on a test, everyone had to hear about it. If he got a promotion, the story would stretch for weeks. And if I ever stumbled, even a little, he treated it like proof that he had been right about me all along. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't defend myself. I simply checked the time on my watch and leaned back in my chair. Outside the window, the harbor lights flickered against the dark water, and the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Michael kept talking, building his story piece by piece while the rest of the table listened with that careful politeness families sometimes use when they're unsure whether to laugh or step in. I let him continue. In fact, I wanted him to. Because in just a few minutes, someone was going to walk across the dining room toward our table, and when that happened, the entire story Michael had been telling was going to change. Michael continued smiling as if the story was only getting better the longer he told it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the edge of the table, enjoying the attention that had settled around him. It is not easy out there right now, he said, shaking his head with a kind of theatrical sympathy. Jobs disappear fast. Companies downsize. Next thing you know, you are sitting at home sending out resumes. He glanced at me while he said it, making sure everyone noticed who the comment was about. Caroline gave him a small nudge with her foot under the table, but Michael ignored it. My mother looked uncomfortable, twisting the cloth napkins slowly in her hands as if she was trying to fold the moment into something smaller. Daniel has always been smart, she said softly, attempting to smooth things over. He will figure things out. Michael nodded quickly, but the smile on his face never faded. Of course he will, he replied. He just needs a little motivation. The waiter arrived with a tray of appetizers then, placing small plates of crab cakes and grilled vegetables in front of us. The scent of butter and garlic drifted across the table, but the conversation had already taken on its own momentum. Tyler cleared his throat and asked Michael about his latest project at work, clearly trying to redirect the evening, but Michael only answered briefly before steering the topic right back again. Honestly, Daniel might like working here, he said, gesturing casually around the dining room again. Free meals, nice view of the harbor. Not a bad place to start rebuilding. I could see the faint reflection of the table in the window beside me. The soft lights from the ceiling created a warm glow across the polished wood surface, and beyond that the dark water stretched across the marina where boats rocked gently against their moorings. The city lights shimmered in long thin lines across the harbor, broken every few seconds by the quiet movement of a passing ferry. I listened to Michael continue talking while the rest of the table tried to keep the mood polite. It was the kind of awkward politeness people fall into when they know someone has crossed a line, but no one wants to start a confrontation at a family dinner. I picked up my fork and cut into one of the crab cakes slowly, letting Michael's voice fade into the background. The truth was that I had seen this pattern my entire life. Michael liked stories where he was the successful one and someone else played the role of the cautionary tale. Tonight it happened to be me. What Michael did not realize was that the story he was telling had already reached its final chapter. I checked my watch again. The second hand moved quietly around the dial, each small click bringing the moment a little closer. Across the room a group of business travelers stood near the entrance speaking with one of the staff members. The host desk lights reflected off the marble floor as guests came and went through the front doors. Somewhere near the bar a glass shattered softly and someone laughed in surprise. The restaurant carried on the way busy restaurants always do, full of quiet movement and low conversation. And then I noticed a familiar figure stepping out from a hallway near the back of the dining room. She paused for a moment, scanning the tables, her posture confident and professional. When her eyes finally found our table, she began walking toward us with steady steps. I took another calm sip of water and set the glass back down beside my plate. Michael was still talking, still explaining to everyone how difficult the job market had been for me. He did not notice her approaching yet. None of them did. But I did, and I knew that in just a few seconds the entire tone of this dinner was about to change. I watched her approach while Michael continued talking, still completely unaware of what was about to happen. His voice carried easily across the table as he described the so-called challenges of finding work these days, speaking as if he had been personally guiding me through a long period of failure. The economy is strange right now, he said, shaking his head again with that confident tone he liked to use when explaining other people's lives. Some people adapt faster than others. Tyler nodded politely, though I could see he was beginning to feel uncomfortable. Caroline stared down at her plate, slowly cutting her food into smaller pieces even though she had barely taken a bite. My mother kept glancing toward me, clearly hoping I would say something to defend myself, but I only sat there quietly. The woman walking toward our table moved with calm purpose, her black blazer perfectly fitted, a small silver name badge catching the soft light of the dining room. She passed two other tables without slowing down, her attention fixed in our direction. I recognized the quiet efficiency in the way she carried herself. It was the same posture I had seen earlier that afternoon during a meeting in one of the private conference rooms upstairs. Michael finally paused long enough to sip from his drink. You know what I always say, he added with a small laugh, sometimes people need a push before they get serious about life. I looked up at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the conversation had started. I did not say anything. I simply nodded once and then glanced past him as the woman reached the edge of our table. She stopped beside Michael's chair, her expression professional but warm. For a brief moment the entire table went silent as everyone noticed her standing there. Michael turned slightly, surprised to see a member of the hotel staff interrupting our dinner. He straightened in his chair immediately, his posture shifting into the confident tone he used whenever he believed someone from the service staff might be paying attention to him. "Is there a problem?" he asked politely. The woman did not answer right away. Instead, she looked past him toward me. The recognition in her eyes was immediate. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said clearly. Her voice carried just enough to reach everyone seated around the table. "I apologize for interrupting your dinner." Michael's smile froze in place as he slowly turned his head toward me. The rest of the table followed his movement, each pair of eyes shifting in my direction at the same time. I set my fork down beside my plate and gave her a small nod. "Good evening, Olivia," I replied calmly. She inclined her head slightly, the kind of respectful gesture someone offers during a business meeting. "The ownership group has arrived earlier than expected," she continued. "They are waiting for you in the harbor conference room whenever you are ready." No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound at the table was the quiet clink of glassware from somewhere across the restaurant. Michael blinked twice, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "Ownership group," he repeated slowly, the words sounding uncertain as they left his mouth. Olivia maintained her polite smile. "Yes," she said. "They wanted to review the investment presentation with you before tomorrow morning's board discussion." I leaned back in my chair and folded my napkin neatly on the table. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "I will join them in a few minutes." Olivia nodded once more. "Of course, Mr. Carter." Then she turned and began walking back across the dining room, leaving behind a table full of stunned silence. I watched Olivia walk away across the dining room while the silence at our table stretched longer than anyone expected. Michael still had his glass halfway raised in his hand, frozen in the middle of what had probably been another comment he planned to make. His eyes followed Olivia for a moment and then slowly returned to me. "Ownership group," he repeated again, this time quieter, as if the words themselves were confusing. No one else spoke. The restaurant around us continued moving in its usual rhythm. Waiters carried trays between tables. Soft jazz drifted through the speakers above the bar. A couple near the window laughed at something in their conversation. But at our table the air had changed completely. My mother looked from me to Michael and then back again, clearly trying to understand what had just happened. Caroline set her fork down gently and folded her hands together, her curiosity no longer hidden. Tyler leaned back slightly in his chair, eyebrows raised. Michael cleared his throat and forced a small laugh, the kind people use when they think there must have been some misunderstanding. "So," he said, gesturing loosely in the direction Olivia had gone, "what was that about?" I reached for my glass again and took a calm sip of water before answering. "A meeting," I said simply. Michael frowned. "A meeting?" he echoed. "Here?" I nodded once. "Upstairs." The confusion on his face deepened. For a moment he looked around the table as if someone else might explain it for him. When no one did, he leaned forward again. "Wait," he said slowly. "The manager said something about an investment presentation." I placed the glass back on the table and adjusted the cuff of my sleeve. "That is correct." My mother blinked in surprise. "Daniel," she said softly, "are you working with this hotel?" I could see the curiosity spreading around the table now, replacing the awkward sympathy that had filled the space earlier. Michael's confident expression had faded into something much more cautious. I leaned back in my chair again and looked out briefly toward the harbor lights before answering. "A group of investors has been reviewing several waterfront properties for the past few months," I said. "This hotel happens to be one of them." Tyler let out a quiet whistle. "You mean buying it?" he asked. "Potentially," I replied. Michael stared at me as if the sentence had arrived in a language he had never heard before. "Hold on," he said quickly. "You are telling us you are part of an investment group buying hotels?" I shook my head slightly. "Not exactly." The table waited. I kept my voice calm and even. "I am leading the group." The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. Caroline's eyes widened. Tyler sat up straight. My mother looked at me with a mixture of surprise and pride. Michael did not move for several seconds. His expression shifted slowly from disbelief to realization, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. I reached for my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. The meeting tonight is about the final numbers, I added. If everything goes well, the purchase will be completed next week. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the table in front of him. The man who had been confidently explaining my unemployment only minutes earlier suddenly had nothing to say. Michael finally shifted in his chair, the earlier confidence completely gone from his posture. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back at me as if trying to replay the last few minutes in his mind. You are serious, he said slowly. It was not really a question. I nodded once. The waiter returned quietly then, placing fresh glasses of water around the table and asking if anyone needed anything else. No one answered right away. The conversation that had filled the evening earlier had vanished, replaced by a careful silence that felt very different from before. Michael had spent most of the night explaining my supposed failures to everyone at the table. Now he seemed unsure where to place his hands. He adjusted his jacket and forced a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Well, he said after a moment, that is, impressive. Tyler leaned forward with clear curiosity. How long has this been happening? He asked. The investment thing. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the table. About 2 years, I said. Most of that time has been spent reviewing properties and meeting with partners. My mother looked at me carefully. You never mentioned any of this, she said. Her voice carried more surprise than accusation. I gave her a small, calm smile. You never asked, I replied gently. Michael let out a quiet breath through his nose. The earlier jokes he had made about dishwashing jobs and unemployment now hung in the air like something everyone wished could disappear. Caroline glanced at him briefly before looking back at me. So this meeting tonight, she asked, is about buying this hotel? Possibly, I said. If the final numbers make sense. Tyler looked around the restaurant again, this time with a different expression, as if the room itself had suddenly become more interesting. This place must be worth a fortune, he said quietly. I shrugged slightly. Waterfront properties usually are. Michael finally spoke again, though his voice had lost the easy confidence it carried earlier. You should have told us, he said. I tilted my head slightly. Why? I asked calmly. He hesitated, clearly searching for a reasonable answer. None came. The truth was simple. For most of the evening he had been more interested in telling my story than hearing it. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. I am proud of you, she said quietly. I squeezed her hand once and then let go. Across the dining room I could see Olivia speaking with another member of the staff near the hallway that led toward the private meeting rooms upstairs. She glanced briefly in our direction and gave a subtle nod, reminding me that the real reason I was there tonight was still waiting. I picked up my napkin and folded it carefully beside my plate. I should not keep them waiting, I said. The table watched as I pushed my chair back and stood. Michael looked up at me, the earlier amusement from his voice completely gone now. Daniel, he said, almost cautiously. I paused. Yes? He hesitated again before speaking. Good luck with the meeting. I gave him a small, polite nod. Thank you. Then I turned and began walking across the dining room toward the hallway where Olivia had disappeared, leaving behind a table that had grown very quiet. I walked through the dining room at an unhurried pace, the quiet hum of conversation and clinking glasses following behind me like distant background music. The hallway leading to the conference rooms was lined with framed photographs of the harbor taken decades apart, showing how the waterfront had slowly transformed over the years. At the end of the corridor, Olivia was waiting beside a set of tall wooden doors. When she saw me approaching, she straightened slightly and gave a professional smile. "They are ready whenever you are, Mr. Carter," she said. I nodded once. "Thank you." She opened the door and stepped aside. Inside the harbor conference room, a group of 5 people sat around a long polished table overlooking the water. A stack of documents rested near the center beside several tablets and glasses of sparkling water. The atmosphere inside the room was calm and focused, the quiet kind of concentration that usually accompanies serious decisions. As I entered, a tall man with gray hair stood up from his chair and extended his hand. "Daniel, good to see you again," he said. We were beginning to wonder if dinner downstairs had run long. I shook his hand firmly. "Family gatherings have a way of doing that," I replied with a small smile. The others around the table greeted me in turn, some with handshakes and others with polite nods. I took my seat near the center and opened the leather folder in front of me. Through the large windows behind the table, the harbor lights shimmered across the dark water, the same view my family had been looking at just minutes earlier. The man at the end of the table adjusted his glasses and slid a document toward me. "We reviewed the revised numbers you sent earlier today," he said. "Everything appears consistent with the projections." I glanced over the page quickly, recognizing the figures immediately. Months of research and negotiations had led to that single set of numbers printed neatly across the paper. "The waterfront location is the strongest factor," I said calmly. "Tourism traffic continues to increase each year, and the renovation plans will raise occupancy rates significantly." One of the other investors nodded thoughtfully. "And the management team?" she asked. I gestured slightly toward the door where Olivia had stepped back outside. "Already in place," I said. "Experienced and reliable." A brief silence followed as the group considered the information once more. Finally, the gray-haired man folded his hands on the table. "Then I believe we are ready to move forward," he said. The decision settled over the room with quiet certainty. I signed the final page where the tab indicated and passed the document across the table. As the others began reviewing the paperwork, I leaned back slightly in my chair. For a moment, my thoughts drifted back toward the dining room downstairs where my brother and the rest of the family were still sitting around the table. Only half an hour earlier, Michael had been confidently explaining my unemployment to everyone. Now, just one floor above him, the final steps of a multi-million-dollar purchase were quietly being completed. I closed the folder and stood as the others finished their signatures. The gray-haired man smiled again. "Congratulations," he said. "Looks like you just became the newest owner of the Grand Harbor Hotel." I shook his hand once more and thanked everyone around the table before stepping back into the hallway. Olivia looked up as I emerged from the conference room. "Everything go well?" she asked. I gave a small nod. "Yes," I said. "Everything went exactly as planned." I stepped out of the hallway and back toward the dining room with the same calm pace I had used earlier, though the night now felt completely different. The restaurant was still busy, the warm lighting reflecting softly across the polished floors while quiet conversations filled the space. A pianist near the lounge area had started playing a slow melody that drifted through the air like a gentle current. For most of the guests in the room, nothing had changed at all. But as I walked toward our table, I could already see that the mood there had shifted. Michael was sitting slightly turned in his chair, staring at the table as if he had been thinking very hard about something. Tyler and Caroline were speaking quietly to each other, their voices low. My mother noticed me first. Her face brightened the moment she saw me returning through the dining room. "Daniel is back," she said softly. Everyone at the table looked up at the same time. I pulled my chair out and sat down again, placing my hands lightly on the edge of the table. The waiter appeared almost immediately, refilling glasses and asking if we needed anything else. I thanked him and shook my head. For a few seconds no one spoke. Finally Tyler leaned forward, curiosity clear in his voice. So, he said carefully, how did the meeting go? I gave a small nod. It went well. Michael watched me closely now. The earlier confidence that had filled his voice earlier that evening was completely gone. That means the deal is happening, he said slowly. I looked at him and answered in the same calm tone I had used all night. Yes, I said. The purchase agreement was signed a few minutes ago. Tyler let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. You are serious, he said. You just bought this entire hotel. Part of it, I corrected gently. But yes. Caroline glanced around the dining room again, as if seeing the place in a completely different way now. That is incredible, she said quietly. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand again, pride clear in her eyes. Michael remained silent longer than anyone else. He leaned back slowly in his chair and looked toward the harbor through the tall windows. The reflection of the restaurant lights shimmered across the water outside, stretching across the dark surface like long golden lines. Finally he looked back at me. I guess you have not been unemployed after all, he said. The attempt at humor was weak, but it was the closest thing to an apology he seemed able to manage. I gave a small shrug. I took some time between projects, I said. That part was true. Tyler laughed again, this time more openly. That might be the most expensive career break I have ever heard of, he said. The tension at the table began to soften slightly. Even Michael managed a faint smile. The waiter returned with the dinner plates then, setting them carefully in front of each of us. For a moment the conversation shifted toward food and travel and small details that felt much easier to talk about. But every so often someone glanced around the restaurant again, remembering what had been said earlier that night and how quickly everything had changed. I picked up my fork and began eating, enjoying the quiet harbor view through the windows. Across the table Michael looked at me once more, thoughtful now instead of amused. The story he had been telling earlier had ended very differently than he expected. The rest of the dinner continued in a calmer rhythm, though the earlier conversation lingered quietly beneath everything that was said. The waiter brought out the main courses, placing each plate carefully in front of us while the warm scent of grilled steak and roasted vegetables filled the air. For a few minutes the table focused on the food, the small talk returning in slow pieces like a conversation learning how to walk again. Tyler asked a few questions about the harbor view from the upper floors of the hotel. Caroline wondered out loud how long renovations might take if the plans moved forward. My mother listened quietly, smiling every so often as she watched the conversation unfold. Michael remained quieter than usual. He ate slowly, occasionally glancing around the dining room as if seeing the place from an entirely new perspective. At one point he looked toward the bar area, then back at the front entrance, then finally toward the hallway where I had disappeared earlier that evening. It was clear he was still replaying the moment when Olivia had walked to our table. After a while he set his fork down and looked at me again. So how long were you planning this? He asked. His voice was calm now, no longer teasing or loud the way it had been earlier. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. About 18 months, I said. The first 6 months were research. The rest was negotiation. Tyler shook his head slowly in disbelief. That is a long time to keep something like that quiet, he said. I gave a small shrug. Some things are easier to build when they grow quietly. My mother smiled at that and nodded gently, as if the sentence made perfect sense to her. Michael leaned back again in his chair and folded his arms. For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something else, but the words did not come immediately. Finally he spoke again, this time more thoughtfully. You know, he said, I thought I understood what you were doing these past months. I looked at him with a calm expression. Most people think they understand other people's lives, I said. Sometimes they only see a small piece of the story. The harbor lights shimmered again through the tall windows beside us, reflecting softly across the polished table surface. Tyler let out a quiet laugh and lifted his glass. Well, he said, I think tonight might be the most unexpected dinner our family has ever had. Caroline smiled and raised her glass as well. My mother followed a moment later. I lifted mine last. Michael hesitated for a second before joining in. The glasses touched lightly in the center of the table with a soft, clear sound. The mood had changed from awkward to thoughtful, and the earlier jokes about unemployment had completely disappeared. As we continued eating, the restaurant carried on around us just as it had all evening. Guests arrived and left through the front doors. Servers moved quietly between tables. Somewhere near the lounge the pianist shifted into a new melody. Life in the dining room flowed forward as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But at our table the story had taken a very different direction. Michael looked across at me once more, his expression no longer amused or dismissive but thoughtful, almost respectful. For the first time that evening he seemed to be listening instead of speaking. And for the first time in a long while, he was finally seeing the full story instead of the version he had imagined. By the time dessert menus arrived, the tension that had hovered over the table earlier in the evening had completely faded into something quieter and more reflective. The waiter placed the menus down and described a few of the house specialties, including a warm chocolate cake that the restaurant was known for, but most of us were still more interested in the conversation than the food. Tyler was asking questions about the renovation plans while Caroline listened with curiosity, occasionally glancing around the dining room as if imagining how the place might look after the upgrades. My mother sat comfortably in her chair now, the earlier worry gone from her face. Every so often she looked at me with a small smile that carried more pride than words ever could. Michael remained thoughtful. He had not returned to the confident storytelling that had filled the beginning of the evening. Instead he listened quietly while the others spoke, occasionally nodding or adding a short comment before returning to his thoughts. At one point he leaned forward slightly and rested his arms on the table again, though the gesture felt very different from before. "You know," he said slowly, "I think I owe you an apology." The words were simple and not especially dramatic, but they carried a sincerity that the earlier jokes had completely lacked. The table went still for a moment as everyone heard it. I looked at him calmly. "For what?" I asked. Michael exhaled and shook his head slightly. "For assuming things," he said. "And for saying them out loud before I actually knew the truth." I considered his words for a moment. The harbor lights continued shimmering through the tall windows beside us while the quiet music in the lounge drifted across the dining room. Around us other guests were finishing their meals, laughing with friends, celebrating birthdays, or simply enjoying the evening. Life moved forward in the gentle rhythm of a busy restaurant. Finally, I nodded once. "It happens," I said. Michael gave a small half-smile, the kind people use when they know they have learned something important. "Still," he added, "I should have asked instead of assuming." Tyler raised his glass slightly as if to lighten the mood again. "Well," he said, "if this hotel ends up being half as successful as tonight's dinner story, I would say the investment was a good idea." Everyone laughed softly at that, including Michael this time. The waiter returned with the desserts we eventually ordered, placing the plates carefully on the table while steam rose gently from the warm chocolate cake. For a few minutes the conversation shifted back to ordinary things again. Travel plans, family memories, and stories from earlier years slowly filled the space that had once been occupied by awkward silence. As the evening began to wind down, I looked once more through the tall windows toward the harbor. The water was calm and the city lights reflected across its surface in long golden lines. Earlier that night my brother had told everyone a story about who he thought I was. But stories have a way of changing once the full picture becomes clear. Sometimes the truth does not need to be shouted across a table. Sometimes it simply waits for the right moment to walk quietly into the room and speak for itself.